At Methodist Healthcare Ministries, we are broadening the definition of healthcare because we know that health is more than what happens at a doctor's office. Your health is affected by the things you eat, the water you drink, and the environment where you live, work, play, and pray. Visit MHM.org to learn more. At Methodist Healthcare Ministries, we are broadening the definition of healthcare because we know that health is more than what happens at a doctor's office. Your health is affected by the things you eat, the water you drink, and the environment where you live, work, play, and pray. Visit MHM.org to learn more. At Methodist Healthcare Ministries, we are broadening the definition of healthcare because we know that health is more than what happens at a doctor's office. Your health is affected by the things you eat, the water you drink, and the environment where you live, work, play, and pray. Visit MHM.org to learn more.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. We have a full house here in San Angelo, which is wonderful. People are grabbing their lunch. I'll also just mention, open your bag of chips now, so there's not that really awkward noise during the conversation. I don't mind, you can be rude to me, that's fine. My name is Matt Ewald. I serve the Texas Tribune as Senior Director of Events and Live Journalism. Welcome to those joining us in person here at Angelo State University in San Angelo, and those joining us online for our program today titled Rural Texas and the 2025 Legislative Session. featuring a one-on-one conversation with Representative Drew Darby and a panel conversation with members of the Tribune's Regions team about wins for rural Texas this session and what priorities remain. So our program today, as mentioned, will be in two parts and will run until approximately 1:30. Our in-person and online audience can submit questions for both programs through our Q&A portal at texastribune.org/ask. That's texastribune.org/ask. For those in person, you will find a QR code right in the back of the room there. You can also flag me down, and I have some sheets of paper so you can get right to that Q&A portal. And online, you'll see the URL at the bottom of the screen throughout the program. And I have some note cards if you just prefer to write your questions down for us. We are grateful for the support of our sponsors. Our major sponsors for today's program are Methodist Healthcare Ministries and Raise Your Hand Texas. Our supporting sponsor is Texas Rural Education Association. Please note that while sponsorship provides critical support for the Tribune, sponsors play no role in programming or the line of questioning for Tribune events. We want to thank our host, Angelo State University, for hosting us for today's conversations. Here to offer a welcome on behalf of the university is President Ronnie Hawkins.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for being here. It was an honor for us to extend the invitation. We're doubly excited that the Texas Tribune accepted that invitation and to have Representative Darby here as well. We're excited to have you here on the campus and here at the LeGrand Alumni Center. So on behalf of all the faculty, the staff, and the students here at Angelo State, we extend that welcome and excitement to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, President Hawkins. We also want to thank those, all those around the state who make the journalism of the Tribune, including events like this, possible by becoming Texas Tribune members. To learn more and to become a member, you can visit texastribune.org/support. And then lastly, and we even have some festival speakers here in the room with us, a couple weeks ago we announced our second batch of speakers for the 2025 Texas Tribune Festival. Among those joining us in Austin, November 13th through 15th, are Margaret Spellings, former U.S. Secretary of Education, Michael Curry, former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, former U.S. Representative Beto O'Rourke, entrepreneur and founder and managing partner at 8VC, Joe Lonsdale, and journalist and trial lawyer Katie Fang. You'll find a number of Texans, Texas leaders in our upcoming announcements, but we hope you'll join us at TribFest in November. So let's get to today's first conversation. State Representative Drew Darby represents 10 counties in West Texas, encompassing the Big Country, Concho Valley, and the Permian Basin. A lifelong West Texan and native of San Angelo, he currently serves as chairman of the House Committee on Energy Resources and is a member of the Administration and State Affairs Committee. Moderating today's one-on-one conversation is Texas Tribune Editor-in-Chief Matthew Watkins. I thank our audience for joining us today and turn the program over to Matthew.
All right. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Representative, for being here. So I've been starting these off as we've gone around the state doing these reviews with a congratulations for making it through a legislative session, but it appears that we're not quite done yet.
That's a premature congratulation.
Exactly.
We'll see you sometime later this year.
Exactly. I've learned my lesson. So as I'm sure most people in this room know, the governor announced late Sunday night, maybe more even early Monday morning, that there will be a special session of the legislature this year. That coincided with a veto of the THC ban, a bill that banned substances with the substance that basically gets you high in marijuana or synthetic substances in hemp. Things like that. We'll see whether, what else gets added to that. But I want to talk about this first. This was an issue that was important in some ways to agriculture interests across the state, a topic that came up kind of along the lines. This ban was something that you voted for in the regular session. I'm curious what your reaction is to the veto that Abbott did.
Well, thanks, Matt. If you'll allow me to, these are my hometown folks, and I just wanted to thank them for being here today. I want to thank my staff. Lori Wilson, my district director's here, and Pierce Law is my Angelo State University intern that we had during the last session. So thanks to Angelo State and for allowing us to use Pierce. And I see friends and folks we've lived, worked, sweated together, building a community here in rural Texas, and we have our challenges. Now, Matt just talked about THC. You know, from an agricultural standpoint, over my service in the legislature, we always try to figure out how we can help, and that's not so good a policy sometimes when you say we're from the government, we're here to help. Well, we were trying to help. We were trying to help our farmers and trying to come up with a cash crop that they could invest in and grow and would have a market for it. Well, as we often do, we sometimes create more problems than we're trying to fix. And this is probably one of those occurrences. When we said you can grow hemp, and there are multiple products that are associated with it, what we didn't really do is set up a regulatory framework to regulate and license and monitor and inspect some of the products that have been developed through that CBD effort. And there are synthetics, and I'm not at all an expert in this, but there are some, such as Delta 9, which has a greater, it's a synthetic, but it has a greater propensity for hallucinogenic properties. And so what we're seeing is a proliferation of related businesses come out of this effort to help hemp here in Texas. And now you see it all over the state. I think there are 30 vape shops here in San Angelo, for example. I was astounded to find that out. What they sell is largely unregulated. It is packaged in forms that are appealing to kids, both kids in junior high and high school, and of course their appeal to adults. We have spun off infused beverages that are sold at our liquor stores. By the way, the amount of those beverages sold in liquor stores throughout the state of Texas, 13% of their business, so it's a huge business. Overall, this industry has grown to about $8 billion. And I mentioned the 30 stores here in Texas. Well, that's 30 landlords, that's 30 tenants. There are employees associated with that. And so the lieutenant governor made it a priority to ban THC in Texas. Well, that's a noble goal, but the cat's kind of out of the bag. We now have a full thriving industry which a lot of people are dependent upon and enjoy participating in. We had that bill referred to State Affairs. I'm on the State Affairs Committee, and we heard nearly 20 hours of testimony from folks all over this state that say these products are important for us in our life, particularly veterans who have related service injuries, and there are all kinds of stories about the VA. The only option to these veterans is opioids, and so these THC products provide an alternative that's not opioids, and they want it, they need it, they ache like most of us in this room do from age and maladies that have occurred over the years, and so some of these products help you sleep, help you de-energize, if you will, slow down at night. I had one liquor store owner said their biggest customers are soccer moms. After they drop their kids off, they stop in, literally, they stop in and buy a six-pack of these infused beverages, and they're able to get through the day with it. But all that's to say, after we heard the testimony, the bill that came over from the Senate had a total ban. Members of my committee and our chairman, Ken King from the Panhandle, Canadian, said, we don't want to ban it. We want to regulate it. We want to license it. We want to tax it. We want to supervise it. We want to make sure there's truth in labeling, truth in packaging, try to keep the products away from kids. But let's instead of banning it, let's try to put some reasonable regulations on it. And so we passed it out of the State Affairs Committee. Came to the floor, and as you might suspect, the Lieutenant Governor was having a real serious episode, if you will. Might have needed some of those products, but anyway, it became perfectly clear that there was nothing going to be advanced in the Senate from the Texas House unless we reinstituted a complete ban. And a physician from Houston, who is Dan Patrick's back door neighbor, had an amendment to the bill that stripped everything out and went back to the total ban. That's what we passed, and that's what went to the governor, and that's what the governor vetoed.
So, and if I'm not mistaken, you voted for the kind of the regulations that came out of State Affairs before that happened. So, is what I'm hearing from you essentially, given the choice between doing nothing regulating and banning it completely, you fall on the regulating, but that wasn't the decision before the House, essentially, given Dan Patrick's stance.
We were given an ultimatum. If it didn't go back to a complete ban, then there would not be another House bill advanced in the Texas Senate. That was perfectly clear. And so we stripped it out and we passed it, and that's what the governor vetoed. So I'm in favor of let's go back to taking a hard look at the industry. Let's see where we need to have full, complete licensure. Let's have regulations regarding packaging, truth in labeling, testing, and ultimately taxation for that. And so I think that's the best path. I think hopefully the governor and lieutenant governor will agree with that path, and we can kind of have a meaningful discussion come July the 21st when we're all come back together. I don't know why they call it a special session. There's nothing special about these times. I never have understood that. This will be my 14th time in which we call this group gathering we have special, and it's just not special. And so, but I anticipate that we'll have many more issues that will be added to that, including perhaps redistricting, which might.
Well, that was going to be my next question, right? So for folks in the room who may not have been following this story, it has been reported by numerous outlets, including the Tribune, that there has been efforts underway from the White House to push Texas to redistrict its congressional seats, perhaps as an idea to add some more Republican seats that could help Republicans hold the U.S. House in the upcoming midterm elections. Midterm elections, of course, often challenging for the party that holds the White House. But there's been some skepticism, including among Republicans, about whether this is a good idea, right? I mean, when y'all drew the maps most recently, it was really done in a way not necessarily to aggressively add a bunch of new Republican seats for the Congress or the legislature, but to make sure that you protected the numbers that you had long term and hold on to those majorities long term. Some questions about whether trying to add some Republican seats in the middle of this session would actually be a good long-term move for Republicans. I wonder where you stand on this question. Do you think redistricting is a good idea right now?
Well, of course, I haven't talked directly with any of our statewide leaders on this, nor have I talked to any of the congressional delegation. I will tell you that I chaired redistricting for 2 sessions. And so I'm fully aware of the dynamics involved in when you start redrawing people's districts. And so I would simply ask the congressional delegation, August Pfluger, Jody Arrington, some of the folks around here, do you really want to go through a process in which you would take voters that have elected you? Do you want and try to move them perhaps to other districts, lessening perhaps the Republican influence in your district and increasing Republican influence in other districts, do you really want to do that? So I think the delegation themselves need to come to a decision as to what they want to do. I think it would be, we still haven't resolved the litigation over the last redistricting. You know, so this is a cottage industry where lawyers, that's all they do is sue about redistricting. It takes about 10 years until the next census, and then you redistrict and you start the litigation all over again. I think it's a bad idea myself personally, and again, I've not talked to any of the other, some of my other colleagues on it. I just think that we did it according to the law. And I think we need to live with it and the effects until we have the next census.
Folks in Austin seem to be saying that the pressure is pretty strong, though, on Abbott to add this to the call. Do you have a sense as to whether this is going to happen?
Well, I'm just looking at the overall picture. I would say that if the administration wants it, it's probably going to happen.
Okay, well, let's turn to the looking back now toward the regular session. It was a session that in many ways was defined by education, right? The politics of this legislature have been defined by education for the last several years. Of course, we all remember the big fight over school vouchers, education savings accounts last session that failed due in part to opposition by rural Republicans, including yourself, if I remember correctly. There was a lot that happened between then and now, right? Including a lot of those rural Republicans losing their primaries and being essentially voted out. We come to a legislative session where the math was different. It seemed as though this voucher legislation was going to pass. Abbott and other supporters had the numbers. And this year you voted for it. Can you tell us a little bit about the reasoning there? What caused you to be a yes vote this time around?
Well, thank you for that question. I knew it wouldn't take long to get there, but clearly if there's a seminal issue that affects rural Texas, it's education. Moms and dads are not going to live in rural Texas unless they have good schools. Of course, they got to have roads and water and healthcare and all that other stuff, but without good schools, people are not going to live and work in rural Texas. And so I've been keenly involved in that issue from the very start and feel very passionate about supporting public education. I see a lot of my public education friends and longstanding colleagues here that have fought the fight with us to try to get proper funding for education. In 2011, we cut $5 billion out of public education because of our budget. We've never restored that. So over the last 8 years or so, we have been particularly focused on trying to get more funding for public education. Well, we had statewide leaders that believed that we needed to have a second option, a choice, if you will. That's how they styled it, but in my opinion, we have choice. What's really on the table is vouchers. That is taking public funds and moving them to private or parochial schools and using public dollars to do that. And so I've been opposed to that, primarily because I think it takes whatever we put into that mechanism takes away from public schools. But over the years, what has developed is a bargaining tool, if you will, by statewide leaders to say, we're not going to give you funding for public schools unless you agree to a voucher program, educational savings account. And so for the last 3 sessions, that's exactly what the choice we had. We could not get proper funding for our public schools without having to agree to a voucher program. In the last session that came to a head, we were able to strip out the ESA program from public school funding. We were ready to vote for teacher pay raise and proper school funding, but we weren't able to because the leadership said you're not going to be able to vote for one without the other. So then the fight began. The fight began in the off season when you had outside influence billionaires who make money off school vouchers. They either sell the software or they build the schools or they're involved in the process. And so they invested, in one case, over $16 million to try to beat mostly rural Republicans who believe that public schools should be funded first. And so that election, Vonna McCurley, I see my election administrator over here, elections have consequences. And so with all that money that came in, it was successful. There were 15 mostly rural Republicans that were targeted. 12 got beat. 12 got beat. I myself, Gary Van Dever, and Stan Lambert from Abilene were the only ones who were able to be successful. And so the die was cast then. So the numbers, we weren't going to have the numbers. But what we were able to do, we were able to elect a speaker, Dustin Burrows from Lubbock, Texas, who was able to put together a coalition of folks who still cared about public education. And so we were given a voice in trying to make sure that we had influence and input into that process. And we did. And so we were able to put measures, some 4 at the last day, we were able to put amendments into the bill that did some, I think, positive things that allowed us to limit it to $1 billion, give or take a few million. Was it, now you're talking about some real money, but $1 billion. Okay, we were able to put some audit requirements in it. We were able to limit it to schools that had been in existence for 2 years or more. We were able to make sure that mostly affluent Anglo families in suburban, large metropolitan areas did not take all the money. They're limited to 20% of the fund. So we put measures in there. And also, we negotiated at the same time, we negotiated HB2, which is the school finance bill. And when it left the Texas House, we had $8.5 billion in there, primarily for, to put in the basic allotment, which does the best. I see Dr. Moran here. Any supervisor will tell you that the best tool that they have is put money in the basic allotment. That gives them the most flexibility to run their schools. So we were able to do all that, and so based upon all that, I was able to vote yes. I still lose sleep over that, folks. I mean, that's not a vote that I took lightly. But I liken it to if you have a house burning, do you sit there and watch it burn, or you try to rush in and try to save some of the valuables? And I think that's exactly my mental state when we had to take that vote. Is do I want to put this issue behind us in the rearview mirror and let's attack other issues? Am I going to be relevant to talk about water, talk about roads, to talk about health care, to talk about higher education? Am I going to be relevant in those conversations, or am I going to be isolated as I was during the last election cycle? Are we going to have relevance in rural Texas to talk about the real issues that matter to rural Texas if we don't have a seat at the table? And so that's what that vote was about. For whatever reason, it became the linchpin for relevance in the whole session. And so that's why I did it. Again, given hindsight, I would do it again.
So is implicit in that, relevance and things like that, that there were maybe forces that would have worked against you had you not voted for it? I mean, there were questions raised about whether you would have vetoes that bills that would be vetoed, or challenged again in the next election. I mean, how much of it was trying to influence and get things right, and how much of it was people sending the message to you, particularly maybe the governor, that if you don't do this, there will be consequences for you in your district?
I think those messages were delivered. I mean, clearly, politics is hardball. And you've got folks with large egos that won't have an agenda and want to get things done. And if you don't help them along the way, then they have long memories. And so, yeah, I mean, I just think our needs out here are multifaceted. Most everybody in this room we're probably not going to see, I would say, no more than 10 vouchers in the whole city of San Angelo. I mean, there's only 100,000 available slots available, and I don't think we're even going to see any. It's really not an issue. We have choice here in Tom Reed County. We have great public schools. We have a great public charter school. We have private and parochial schools. We have one of the largest homeschool delegations in the state. We have choice. But I don't think the idea of creating a voucher program will necessarily impact financially this community or our students, as it will largely urban settings.
You mentioned the financial struggles of schools, the cuts in 2011, the money that was not added in last session because of the voucher fight. This session, $8.5 billion added to public schools. How do you think schools fared overall this session? I mean, do you feel like some of those challenges have been fixed now, or is there more to do?
Well, I will tell you, almost every superintendent that I've talked to, and I've got all their numbers, all their cell phones, they've got all my cell phone and contact information. And I can tell you we communicate regularly during the session. And they're all in dire straits. Most every one of my rural school districts had to adopt a deficit budget, which means that they're spending more money than they're bringing in. They have had to forego programs. They're having to stop services at their school. So it wasn't a question, and I had several of them tell me that it's not a question of really how much. We've got to have additional help right now. You have to get us more money this session. This is absolutely critical. So I think it was time. Let's put the voucher issue behind and let's try to address school funding. Have we even replaced the money we took away in 2011, considering population and inflationary pressures on and value of our dollar? No, we're not even back where we were. Is it enough? In my opinion, no. It's not enough. But that's 5.3 million students here in this state that are affected by the need to satisfy 100,000 students. Think about that a minute, folks. All this fight has been about creating a program for 100,000 students right now. Are they needy? Yes. Are there disabled children? Yes. Are there special needs kids? Yes. Are there kids in failing institutions that need help? Yes. All of that. But the focus was on that cohort and not the 5.3 million public school students who still need help. And so that's the future of this state. Our public schools are the future of this state. And we're either going to educate them or this state's in trouble. So, yeah, and again, my thought and hope and prayer is that we put this issue behind us. Now, are we going to fight next session? You betcha. Because there's going to be folks that come in and say, well, there's 50,000 on the waiting list. We need to fund those 50,000. By the way, the budget projections on that $1 billion without the restraints we put in it was growing to $4 billion. $4 billion a biennium from $1 billion. There's some projection that shows it'll grow to $3 to $4 billion a year, given funding. If this legislature, under the leadership of this state, if this legislature continues to fund applications and we keep having kiddos move out of public schools into private or parochial schools, that number is going to be a lot bigger than $1 billion. And that's going to be the fight next session. Your question earlier, is this fight over? No, this fight is not over. The fight will be next session when we come back and we gauge the success of the program, and we gauge the interest of people that want to get into it, and we gauge the members and the statewide leaders' appetite for funding all of that. That's where the fight will be.
right, just a reminder for folks, if you have a question, texastribune.org/ask, you can submit it. Matt is then sending it to me, which I am getting on my phone and looking on my watch, and I'll try to incorporate it in there. But I want to ask, we talked a little bit about the loss of rural members due to the voucher fight. That meant a big change in kind of the rural delegation, a lot less experience there, aside from you and a few other members. What was the impact on rural Texas to have had that change? And really, I guess maybe just more broadly, what was the impact of the session on rural Texas this time?
Well, I think one calculation was that we lost over 157 years of service in the Texas legislature. That's one impact. And we elected folks who, in some cases, were elected because the incumbent was denigrated to a level that nobody wanted to vote for the incumbent. They perhaps were not elected with their own vision, their own background, their own unique skill sets that would lead to success in the process. So we had 30-something new members. That's a learning process. As with most things, I think there are some really strong folks in there that have a very bright future in the process, and then there's some that I think may be disillusioned that they weren't able to be as effective as they thought they would be or get things done, and so they may not have as robust an appetite, if you will, to come back.
Another big issue this session was water. Big concerns about the future of water supply in this state. Some estimates up to $150 billion needed over the next 50 years in order to meet the growing needs of the state, both from population, the climate, and new demands on water across the state. $2.5 billion added from this session, and if voters approve an amendment in November, $1 billion each year for the next 20 years dedicated to water as well. How much is that going to do for rural Texas and the state as a whole?
Well, that's a good drop in the bucket, as I say. No, it is, and I will tell you that Senator Perry, who represents this city in this area, did a very wonderful job of organizing that effort and stating the goals and then making sure that it passed through the process. So congratulations to Senator Perry and all that he did. It's an area that we're going to have to work on. I see several members of the San Angelo City Council here. I was a former member of that. I understand the infrastructure needs of the city and how part of the challenge is not only delivering water. Do you have water to deliver, but the water that you have, is it leaking out and not going to customers? It's simply leaking out through valves and leaking lines, aging lines. And we're seeing that throughout the state of Texas. And so we received a lot of input in this process about how the money should be directed. And some wanted it all directed to infrastructure. Until we clean up our infrastructure and make sure there's no leaks, there's no sense in getting new water sources. So let's spend it all on infrastructure. Then there's some that says, no, that's the city's responsibility. Let's just try to find new water sources. Let's devote all the money for new water sources. Well, I think arrived right at the middle. I think it's 50-50. And so we'll be taking a look at how cities are able to accommodate these new grant programs to actually repair their water systems and prevent that leakage. We'll also be focusing on new water sources. Now, what are we? Where are they? How do we get them out here? You know, I'm focused from an energy standpoint. I recognize the oil and gas drilling process. In order to produce a barrel of oil, typically there's 5 to 6 barrels of produced water associated with that. We call that oil and gas waste. And I think that's a misnomer now. Quite frankly, if you're going to spend millions of dollars drilling to recover that water from the depths, 10,000 plus feet, you got it on the surface. Why don't we figure out how to use it while we're here, while it's here? And so part of the legislation that I passed under House Bill 49 in particular was incentivizes oil and gas operators to treat that produced water to a level of reuse, and with proper licensing, proper testing, proper monitoring, then they could use that water for alternative purposes, such as industrial or agriculture use. There's a wonderful facility south of Midland that is putting treated effluents, oil and gas waste, on crops and determining which crops are most adaptable to using that water. And I think that's a great possibility for this state. We're also looking at, with proper treatment and monitoring, reintroducing it back into the hydrological cycle, whether it be into an existing stream bed or flowing down to a city for reuse. And I think all of that is in a bright future for this state, but it's very highly energy intensive. It takes a lot of energy to do that, and so which leads to another problem we've had is how do we have enough energy in this state to accommodate not only the people and the industries that are here, but the industries that want to come here in the form of data centers or chip manufacturers or some of the other wonderful opportunities facing the state. Where are they going to get their energy? How are they going to have it delivered to them? So that was another focus of the legislature.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. I mean, you mentioned these new kind of pressures coming out of the grid. We all remember 2021. A lot of people's eyebrows were raised with reports that energy demand on the grid could double because of a lot of the factors that you're talking about in not too long. I believe $5 billion added to the Texas Energy Fund. There were some rules that were voted on that would allow the grid operator to require large load users to shut down in certain moments and things like that. Also, some efforts that really targeted renewable energy did not make it through. A lot of people saying kind of the renewable industry in Texas emerging unscathed at a time where that didn't seem like that might happen at times during this session. Do you feel like that's adequate? Is that going to address the needs there?
Well, of course, you mentioned one of the fights we had the whole session was there was an effort to basically do away with the renewable energy industry here in Texas. And we have seen, particularly in this region, we have seen a lot of projects now installed that are delivering cheaper energy to people who demand energy in this state. It has resulted in benefits to the landowners through royalties and payments. It's resulted in benefits to the schools who have these projects in their districts. It's resulted in benefits and sales taxes and job employment. And so I think it is overall a benefit to this state. So I was in the trenches almost every day, it seemed like, trying to defend against folks who wanted to chip away and do away with one of the active participants in our energy market. And so I'm kind of an all the above guy. I've been an oil and gas lawyer for a number of years, and so I understand the oil and gas industry and the related industries to that, but there are multiple aspects of the oil and gas industry, whether it be brine mining or geothermal, some of the other nuclear. I think everyone in this room should know, if you don't already know, that there's a wonderful small modular nuclear test facility being built in Abilene. That is cutting edge technology. We were able to move that forward. In fact, we were able to get a $120 million grant to Texas Tech University to help facilitate that renewed research with regard to that facility. But that type of technology is going to be particularly well suited for deployment in rural Texas. If you want to treat produced water, you got to go to the Delaware Basin and the Permian Basin, which is located further west. And so, but these large volumes of water, we can no longer inject it back into the ground without seismicity issues. We're running about out of space here in Texas to put that produced water at depth. It's creating seismicity issues. Nobody wants an earthquake disturbing their lunch or their dinner. And so we've got to figure out what to do with it. Well, these small modular units could be deployed in remote parts of Texas that would provide the energy necessary to treat the water to a level of reuse that we could benefit from that. So all of these things are exciting new aspects of an integrated energy market that we have here in Texas. And so I'm excited about that.
Okay, a couple audience questions. One audience member asking, please speak to federal plans once again to make West Texas a dumping ground for nuclear waste. Can you talk about that issue?
Well, I mean, clearly you're referring to this low-level waste facility in Andrews, Texas.
I believe so. I
Yes.
believe that's what the
Okay.
question was on.
Well, interestingly, I helped fund that back early in my legislative career. We were part of a compact with Vermont, if you will, that needed funding, and we were able to get that facility going. But it's a low-level waste facility. There are people that want to turn that facility into a higher level repository. I am against that. I think that should be handled elsewhere and not here in Texas.
Sounds good. Another question from Steve from Fredericksburg. He says, what principles do you use to help you wrestle with the difficult decisions when representing rural Texas in the state?
Well, of course, I'm a believer. I think you have to have a foundational moral and background to make these decisions. I'm a believer that you have to experience it. You can't tell people, especially our children and our grandchildren right now, about the days where we grew up. They don't want to listen to it. But I'll tell you, I've been dead broke in my life multiple times. I've never lost faith in my ability to pull myself out of that hole. And I think everybody in this room, what's particularly compelling to me in rural Texas is that we're survivors. It's not easy out here. We have good weather. Typically it's hot and it's dry and it's windy outside. But we're survivors out here. We don't have things handed to us. We have to make do, and we have to work together. And I think those are the foundational aspects of how I look to govern, is those life experiences, and then just try to do what's right. I make decisions, and I'm comfortable with that, and I go to sleep, and my wife. I go to sleep pretty quickly, to tell you the truth, and she says, she asked me about that, and I said, well, I'm just comfortable with that. I have a clear conscience, and she said, no, you have no conscience. And but if you research the issue, and if you try to dig down and find out what these issues, they're not always black and white. Everybody thinks these issues are black and white. It's just, well, that's an easy decision. Well, it's not, folks. And when you dig down into it and find out what the real issue is before you, and if you learn enough about that issue and concentrate on trying to do what's in the best interest of the most people, then I think you can get comfortable with that and live with that decision.
One final question. We talked about education. We talked about water, energy, the THC hemp issue. A lot of those got a lot of attention during the session. Is there anything affecting rural Texas near and dear to your heart that you feel like flew under the radar that people should be thinking about, talking about from the past 5 months?
Well, I've often said that to live in rural Texas, you have to have 5 things you have to take, and we've talked about a lot of it. We talked about you have to have water, you have to have good roads, you have to get good schools, you have to have good health care, and you have to have good jobs. And if you have all that, then we can deliver the food, fiber, hide, hair, and energy resources necessary to allow people to live in cities. I keep telling my urban colleagues, you like that? You like that car you're driving? Yeah. Well, you like that food you're eating? That cotton suit you're wearing? You like all that? Well, they don't make that in this city. They make it out in rural Texas, and we deliver it to urban Texas. So you've got to allow us to keep enough resources so we'll have good water, we'll have good schools, we'll have good hospitals. And so that's the struggle. People like to focus on Republicans and Democrats. Folks, it's not anything about Republicans and Democrats. And it's really not about, quote, conservative and liberal. Those words are used far too generously. They don't really describe the struggle. The struggle is between rural and urban. And it's how do we maintain our lifestyle here in rural Texas? How do we maintain the essential elements of what it takes to live in rural Texas and balance that with folks who outnumber us? If it comes to a vote, there are 17 state representatives that represent 2/3 of the landmass of Texas. 2/3 of the landmass of Texas. There's 17 of us. There are 25 that represent Harris County alone. Think about that, folks. There's 16 in Dallas County. So how do we do that? We do it with relationships. We do it with primarily people stand by their elected representatives, and we're able to be a part of an institution for years and learn how the system works and learn how to build relationships, and that pays off when it comes to talking about these important legislative matters.
All right. Well, we are right at the end of our time, but thank you so much, Representative, for joining us and giving us this perspective. I'll hand it back off to Matt Ewalt.
Again, on behalf of the Tribune, we thank the representative for joining us. We are going to reset the stage here, but we're going to get right into our next program. Thank you so much, Representative. For our second conversation today, and the representative certainly teed it off well, talking about those 5 things you need for rural Texas. We're going to invite a few members of our Regions team to look at the impact of the legislative session on rural Texas. Joining us are members of the Tribune's Regions team. Moderating is our Regions editor, Nick Garcia, who oversees reporters based in Lubbock, Lufkin, Odessa, McAllen. He is joined today by 2 of those reporters, Lubbock-based reporter Jamie Lozano-Carver, who covers the South Plains and Panhandle, as well as the Tribune's Lubbock-based reporter Carlos Nogueras Ramos. He is a Tribune's Odessa-based reporter who tells stories of Texas from the Permian Basin region. I thank all of those who are joined here today to hear about both wins for rural Texas and the challenges that remain. And I think with that, I will turn the program over to my colleague, Nick.
Thank you, Matt. Hi, everyone. Again, I am Nick Garcia. I'm the Regions editor of the Texas Tribune. As Matt said, this team was established about 3 years ago to tell the story of Texas from outside of Austin. So again, we have reporters based in Lubbock, Lufkin, Odessa, and McAllen, and maybe more to come, maybe one day San Angelo. And it's an honor to be here with all of you and to talk about some of the issues that matter to rural. You know, one of the things I think is really important to think about when we talk about rural Texas is there's a couple different ways to define it. And we take a pretty broad definition of rural Texas at the Tribune, thinking about places that have historic ties to agricultural or industry. So you might hear us talk a little bit about oil and gas, as well as agriculture, among other industries. And I want to start off with ag and hemp because, as you all know, as was just discussed, we have a special session coming largely around the THC ban, which started off as an agricultural issue in Texas. And Jamie, you're based out of Lubbock, and when it became very clear that this ban was happening, you know, we assigned you to go talk to hemp farmers. What did you hear from them about this ban and how it would impact them?
Well, a lot of what I heard, it stems back to what we've been saying, that this was originally passed as a way to, help farmers have a second chance. If your cotton isn't growing, if you're having bad luck with corn, if it's just too inconsistent, hemp is another option. So whenever this ban did become clear, I spoke with farmers out there, and the overall sentiment was just, if they have a chance of catching a felony charge from growing it, they are just completely out of the game altogether. I feel like with this special session coming up, there's a possibility that we might hear more farmers come out to say, that this really has the potential to hamstring them and their businesses. But a lot of the frustration that I heard too was just that they tried that. They tried during the legislative session to be at hearings, to speak with their representatives, to speak with their senators, and it just didn't get them anywhere. It still led to where we're at right now. So it's a tricky situation for hemp growers.
I mean, one of the quotes from your article that we published again right after the ban was passed, literally one farmer said, "We would be felons if we did this." Do you think that message is going to be resonating at the Capitol with the second go around, or is there going to be a change in tactics, do you think?
I'm not sure if there will be a change in tactics. I do think that the message right there really resonates. We're talking about American farmers. We're talking here in Texas about Texas farmers, and they've never been seen in this position of they're doing something illegal, they're doing something wrong, they're criminals, and now this has changed that outlook. And so it's, I think that message alone should resonate with lawmakers, if any message does.
Another bill that passed regarding ag was House Bill 43, which was an issue that a lot of the folks in the ag community were focused on. It would expand the young farmer grant and interest rate reduction laws that we have and programs we have. Carlos, why were those changes really a focus of the ag community, and what exactly do those changes do?
Yeah, it's interesting when you hear Jamie, who's a regions reporter, but ag is a big part of your beat, say that it's a tricky environment for them. And Rep. Darby just said, in what ways can the legislature be helpful? And I think this is one way where a lot of farmers and ranchers could agree that they were. Farmers in Texas deal with a really complicated and sometimes hazardous puzzle. The crops might be working out, but the economics of growing them might not, getting the equipment to be able to sustain your farm. And so HB 43 by Rep. Kitzman, as you mentioned, raises the amount in loans that a farmer can apply for to, I believe, is $1 million. And then accompanied by that is the interest rate reduction program, which lowers it from 5% of repayment interest rate to 2%. So a lot more accessible if you're trying to get some help from the state to try to manage your farm operations in Texas. And then another thing that also helps them is eliminating the age requirements. Previously, only farmers aged 18 to 46 were eligible for this money, whereas now anyone at any age can apply for the program, which is an interesting way for the state, it's usually a federal subsidy that we see a lot of these big grant programs. And so this is a big Texas step to try and fill that vacuum.
Young in age or heart now.
Yeah.
Jamie, I mean, you on our team, you probably talk to farmers and producers the most. What have you just, over the course of, you've been on this team for 3 years now, and you've been reporting from Lubbock, 4 years. What is just the general sentiment of farmers in the ag community right now in Texas in the year 2025? I mean, what are they living with? What are they thinking about every day?
I think if you ask any farmer in Texas, they probably wouldn't say this out loud, but they need help in really every sense of the word. I mean, we're talking about a market that hasn't been stable in a couple of years. The costs that it takes for them to just grow a plant in the last few years have exceeded what they earn from that crop. And even in the cases where, the markets work out nicely and they're able to afford what they can, they have to worry about the weather too. So it really seems like every year there's something that that they're waiting for, in a way. They're waiting for the other shoe to drop. And, even this year, in Lubbock, we've been very lucky. We've had a lot of rainfall this year, which is not the normal case. So it's been nice. But if you talk to farmers out there, they're not confident that this is going to be a good year, because they know August comes around, their crops are most likely going to burn in the heat, and then it'll be a while before they get any relief for that. So they're facing a lot of difficult circumstances, most of which are out of their control, and they're kind of on their own.
And of course, there's all the uncertainty at the federal level too. I mean, we're still working under an old farm bill. We have tariffs coming back and forth, given which day. Do you think that the legislature did anything to help create certainty, whether it's with not just House Bill 43, but around water, health care, thinking about the wildfires? I mean, do you think that this was a good session for rural Texas, for producers, for farmers, just at the 30,000-foot view level?
I think so. I think, any session we could look at it and say, more work could have been done, more things could have been done to help. But, I think HB 43 is a big example of that help. Healthcare, I know we'll talk about more too, but, there's a lot of farmers live in rural communities, and, now Representative King passed a bill that is going to help even increase ambulance services out there. And so, whenever we talk about farmers and what they need, it's also more than just the agriculture side. They need to have good access to healthcare. They need to have access to water as we are facing a water crisis. So it's a lot, but I do think lawmakers made some progress this year.
I feel like my boss, Matthew Watkins, stole my script, because we're going to talk about education next, just like they did in the last conversation. Carlos, you did a lot of reporting out of Ector County School District, again, which covers most of Odessa, the talk over private school vouchers and funding. Where do you think the leaders of that one particular school district are today after the legislative session, and what can we think about for the rest of rural Texas and some of those smaller school districts outside of the triangle?
The folks in education in Odessa, at least the ones who would talk to me, I think are ready to see the vouchers at work. Again, as Rep. Darby, I think aptly put it in his conversation with Matthew, there's been so much talk over so many sessions about the vouchers, the education savings account. How would it work? How much money do you put into it? And do you tie the future of public education to it? And I think it got to a point where they wanted to see it work. They heard so much talk from Governor Abbott about this. And so specifically what the chair of the school board told me was, show me, prove to me that you can run this program responsibly. And then, of course, in the following session, legislative session, we'll see whether the results are there or not. But I also spoke, interestingly, to principals of private schools, for example, Midland, which has a ton of them. And, on their end, they're not ready to celebrate either. For a lot of these schools, there's just such a big wait list that even if you do get the money to put toward your kid, that doesn't necessarily mean, number one, that your kid qualifies in terms of the academic requirements. There's a lot of rigor that goes into being accepted into a private school. Just all of the elements around it. And so everyone is kind of in their wait and see how this all unfolds for them. But for the most part, I think people were ready to see the vouchers at work.
Just a reminder for those of you in the audience and watching online, if you have any questions for the three of us, we'll do our very best to answer them. We're normally the ones who ask the questions, but we will try to answer anything you want to throw at us. You can send them to texastribune.org /ask. Again, texastribune.org /ask. And I think some of you have QR codes on your table. So While most of the world, the political world, was focused on education at the session, our team was focused on water. I think by last count, we wrote 26 articles during the legislative session about the water debate, the water crisis. If you don't know, we're in trouble. As a state, we do not have enough water if we get hit with a historic drought. Jamie, you were part of the lead duo. What the heck happened with water, and what does it mean for rural Texas?
So we talked earlier, we heard Matthew Watkins and Representative Darby speak earlier about how, there's this now $20 billion investment. It's $1 billion a year that'll be going towards Texas water projects for the next 20 years. And this is extremely significant because, in the past couple of years, we've seen a lot more water utilities, a lot of treatment plants in municipalities that are struggling to pay to keep up with the repairs that they need. So this $1 billion a year, it can go towards creating new sources of water, whether that be using desalination or treating produced water. It could also go towards fixing the aging infrastructure that is seen all around Texas, really. It just kind of goes towards really trying to secure our state's water supply. But on top of that, lawmakers, they also, I think one of the other bills another one of the water bills that had people's attention was, it was House Bill 1400 by Representative Cody Harris, and it would basically be strengthening groundwater protections. And, that bill itself didn't pass, but it really showed how even now, as we did get this historic investment into water projects and water needs in Texas, there's still so much ground to cover, including, groundwater protections being a very big concern for rural communities.
And groundwater being the water that's trapped underneath the surface. If you want to know about water, go to texastribune.org. We have an excellent explainer that will tell you everything you ever wanted to know about water that you didn't learn in elementary school. So what did it mean that why was it so important that the two lawmakers who led this effort, a priority for Governor Greg Abbott, were from rural Texas, that being Charles Perry from out here and Cody Harris from East Texas?
I think anytime that we have rural lawmakers who are pushing towards, resolving an issue facing rural communities, that in its own is the benefit because they understand the needs that their communities face. Senator Perry, the farmers out in Lubbock, they love him, they trust him, they feel like they can just give him a call and tell him what's going on, and he'll answer. And it's the same thing that we hear about Representative Cody Harris. And so I think having lawmakers who are really tuned in to what rural water needs are, and I emphasize rural because everybody knows what the water needs are on the base level, but they hit rural communities in a different way and sometimes even in a faster way than what we see in the big urban centers. And so I think that having lawmakers who are from rural areas and who can actually fully understand is, I think, what really helped pass this completely through.
Yeah, and I think, we started reporting on water even before this session with, looking at water infrastructure and the fact that, most boil water notices in the state come from rural Texas because their infrastructure is just older, they can't keep up with repairs. That leads me into my next question, which they talked a little bit during the last session, was this fight over, do we find new water or do we save our infrastructure? I know this kept us up very late many nights. Can you talk a little bit more about why that fight was so important and how it ultimately got resolved?
Yeah, so just for context, this fight that was happening, it was over this $1 billion a year. And essentially what we had is Charles Perry, he wanted to use 80% of that $1 billion for new water supply projects. So to go specifically towards desalination efforts, produced water treatment, just things like that. And that would leave 20% of that $1 billion to cover aging infrastructure, to cover flood management, really just a whole basket of issues that, we have studies estimate need, closer to $150 billion in order to resolve. So 20% of that $1 billion was kind of a non-starter for a lot of nonprofit organizations and water advocates who were, speaking with lawmakers on this issue. And it actually, what we ended up with is a balanced 50-50 split. So now 50% of the funds will go towards new water supply, 50% will go towards aging infrastructure and those other needs. And it's considering how long the debate was, and like you said, how late we stayed up kind of, trying to figure out what will and what won't happen, it was actually the best case scenario.
And part of that fight for new water is produced water. It is the water from oil and gas. And Carlos, you actually went to a treatment center and saw how the water is treated. Can you take us into that facility? Take us into what the future could look like.
I think it might have been the center Rep. Darby mentioned south of Midland, because it's the one center that's treating the water. Yes, it was so fascinating to watch the water debate unfold, because as the legislature was sort of figuring out where to put all this money, the oil and gas industry, was secretly, and when I say secretly, I mean they weren't necessarily advertising this publicly, kind of cracked the code of industry, wastewater. So for those of you who don't know, produced water comes from out of the ground, from the well that a company is drilling. It's full and laced with so many chemicals. I mean, some estimates have it from upwards of 400 to perhaps the thousands, depending on the water sample that you're looking at. The point is, it is a very complicated product to treat. It is not easy to clean. It is very unpredictable and very reactive. And it takes many stages of cleaning it up to get it to a point where the state of Texas can say, okay, we can consume this, and not to mention the amount of energy and money it takes to do that. And so this facility in Midland started small, with literally a small tract of an alfalfa field, to try and figure out whether this water cooperated with the soil and if the plants either died or they grew. And it took them a couple of years, but it did get to the point where the plants kind of grew out of control, which is what I saw, and also the water reacted pretty well with the soil, but the question is whether we can replicate this at a state level. I mean, what you do in a field of alfalfa might not necessarily be what happens when you take it to an actual outcrop or a full ranch or farm. So yeah, it's an interesting debate. The legislature gave the industry what they call what they like to call certainty. They gave the industry, essentially they gave them legal cover to oil and gas companies to sell this water, and if something should happen down the line with the water, it can't come back to the oil and gas company that sold the water in the first place, although I might be getting ahead of myself here a little bit.
You're not, but I did realize I didn't ask you when you came back from that facility if you either drank any of the water or if you ate any of the crops. Did you do any of that? Did they allow you? Oh, okay.
No.
Would you?
I might have pulled a former Colorado governor, stopped and drank the water. No, I wouldn't have. It's worth noting that the state has not approved a single drop of this water to be distributed anywhere. They're still studying it. I believe there's 5 permits in place to discharge the water or essentially put it out to the environment. So no, I wouldn't have drank the water. Not at least until the state gave the say-so that other people could.
And for the record, I am a Colorado native, and my former governor, Hickenlooper, famously drank fracking water when fracking was getting going up in the state. Carlos knows that because I've told him that. Shifting gears a little bit to healthcare, Jamie, you've spent an extraordinary amount covering the rural healthcare crisis. Rural hospitals throughout the state have closed leading up until the pandemic. One of the only priority bills that I'm aware of this legislative session that actually had the word rural in it was HB 18, the Rural Health Stabilization and Innovation Act. What did that do, and what is the hope going forward for rural health care?
So that bill, it essentially creates a state office to basically try to understand what the health is what the financial health is, I should say, of rural hospitals in Texas, and what their needs are. And so this office will basically be tasked with assessing these hospitals around Texas. And, the reason why this is so important is because over the last, I would say, decade or so, Texas has been leading the country in rural hospital closures. And, of course, Texas does have a lot of rural areas, and so that kind of, that alone puts us at a bigger odds of that being the case. But it's still something that lawmakers needed to address. And so the hopes for this bill and for, other healthcare progress that was made this year is to just help rural Texans get access to the healthcare that they need, which in a lot of areas, it could be limited to a clinic or to just, what emergency services you have, and then they transfer you over. So it really is a big step in helping rural Texans just have better healthcare.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't we do a story on maternal health care that we found that it would take longer for someone from like the top of the panhandle to get to an emergency room than going across the Houston area? Didn't we do something along those lines? And the number of hospitals and just basic doctors in rural Texas, I mean, I don't think we can stress enough how few there are.
No, absolutely. I think that's something that's very underestimated. I live in Lubbock right now, and Lubbock is a medical hub for the South Plains. But I grew up in Levelland, and even being in Levelland, which is just 30 minutes away from Lubbock, we had a hospital, we had a clinic with great physicians, and yet they could only handle a little bit of what emergencies came up, and everything else was transferred to Lubbock. So, that's just the reality that's facing a lot of rural communities right now.
And Carlos, we just published a story this week that you wrote looking at a study from UT Arlington that found rural Americans, and we can assume by that rural Texans, overwhelmingly live with chronic pain more than urban counterparts. You talked to some folks in rural healthcare, and what did they think of that study and anything that came out of this legislative session?
Not surprised was the reaction I got from a lot of the folks representing hospitals in rural areas. It's the best known secret in Texas that rural folks, it is just a harder lifestyle because of the jobs they work in: farming, oil and gas. I mean, jobs that take a heavy physical toll on the body, and where you're likelier and more prone to develop the chronic pain that you're referring to, while at the same time being deprived from access to either a primary healthcare doctor or even just a hospital where you can go get treatment, and that just leaves a lot of folks in Texas really vulnerable, for example, to an opioid addiction, whether prescribed by a doctor that they know or not. And then in a worst case scenario, death, that started with, that pain you developed at your job. I think it's still being worked out. People were happy to see some more money in certain areas, as well as easing up some regulatory requirements in some areas for nurses, for example, to be able to do jobs with a certain license and without having to seek out additional paperwork, and go through the bureaucratic hog of trying to do something, which is what keeps Texas from progressing in a lot of ways. But again, we just finished a legislative session. We found out, not too long ago that we're heading into a special session. So a lot of this is going to be in the rulemaking. In other words, how are the state agencies that the lawmakers, are handing off these laws to are going to write the rules around this, and how are they going to be implemented? So we'll see.
So we have about 15 minutes left, so one more reminder that you can submit questions to texastribune.org/ask, or if you're in the room and you just want to throw a question at Matt Ewalt, who's over there in that corner, feel free. I'm going to ask one more question before we go to audience questions, which is going back to the Panhandle wildfires, which was arguably one of the largest storylines to impact rural Texas over the last couple of years. More than 1 million acres burned up in the Panhandle. We covered the fires aggressively and the legislative response. Jamie, there were several bills that were passed, not only to focus on wildfires, but just rural emergency preparedness in general. What happened?
Of course, we mentioned earlier about Representative King passing the bill for rural ambulance services, and if you look at the bills that were passed for wildfires, or in response to the wildfires, it followed a lot of the same tracks. So one of the big things that, or one of the big bills, I should say, that was passed by Senator Sparks, it addresses, in a way, those needs in rural communities. There will be now a wildfire risk study that is going to be conducted. And that study will be looking into basically, what are the risks, or what are the causes that really contribute to wildfire risks, and what are the population areas, so the neighborhoods and the residencies that are close to those wildfire areas, and so those would be creating wildfire risk zones. In that case, there was also increased funding for rural volunteer fire departments. And so, we did see lawmakers, particularly, I would say the lawmakers who represent the Panhandle, really take those recommendations from the investigative committee last year seriously. Which was the thing when the wildfires broke out and we were up there covering. I mean, a lot of these counties were, that were literally surrounded by the fires, relied heavily on their volunteer firefighters, of which there were few and far between. The ones they did have, were 2 here, 2 in the other corner, trying to keep the fire from breaching into the city, and which, led the state to dispatch state resources, bringing firefighters from other areas. So I think that was a pretty huge advancement, I'd say.
There were not all of the recommendations, though, did pass, right? There was one bill, I'm thinking about the communication bill. Can you talk a little bit about what happened there?
So the bill that Nick is referring to, it was a bill by Representative King that would have created what would have been the first Interoperability Council of Texas. And essentially what this council would have been tasked to do, they would have been creating the first of its kind statewide network that connects all first responders in Texas to all the appropriate state agencies, which really, whenever the wildfires were going on, we heard from firefighters then that that disconnect in their communications really made their jobs harder. They didn't know who to talk to. Whenever state agencies were there to help, it was kind of a scramble because nobody knew where they needed to go in situations like that. And so this Interoperability Council would have created this statewide network that, even I would say emergency experts had come out and said that this was a very bold move by Representative King, but it did not go through.
All right, audience questions.
Great. So we have a few questions that have been submitted here that I'll ask in our few minutes remaining here. I'll ask this question and have a follow-up along with it, because with some of these issues, they may or may not be issues that you all have covered extensively. This person writes, with the Austin-born fascination with legalizing THC, has anyone considered the downsides of widespread THC use? They say, after all, 20 to 30% of rural county jails house inmates who have some level of mental illness and accompanying cost of pharma drugs to treat. Does anyone in Austin worry about the negative impact of widespread THC use? I want to reference that question, but then also ask, as journalists and based around the state and not in Austin, how do you approach issues like this one that may have different public support around the state, and without casting aspersions on the person who wrote the question, may also have assumptions about the support of other communities, whether that be THC or other issues, again, that have different levels of support?
Yeah, I'll take that question and just to peek a little bit behind how the sausage is made. Every day at the Texas Tribune, editors get together twice a day, once in the morning and once at night. And literally Monday morning, the conversation we had was, okay, how do we go out and how do we cover this story correctly, fairly? And one of those very questions we had, and one of the marching orders from our editor-in-chief was, to think about that very issue, right? Like, there are a lot of legitimate concerns to be discussed around any drug use, right? And so I think, you will be seeing those types of stories come out from the Texas Tribune, maybe from this team on the stage, maybe not. But, I think along with, the coverage we did leading up to the ban, we also talked about, this new psychedelic market that Texas is investigating. We did talk about, expanding the medical marijuana market that lawmakers did. So we definitely need to take any issue from a variety of points of view, right? There's always more than two sides to every story. That's what I tell my team. It's not just, Democrats or Republicans. It's multifaceted, and so I do think you'll see some of those stories coming out at the texastribune.org.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Steve writes, some rural Texans like me are taking the initiative to solve our water shortage by installing rainwater collection. Is there any discussion of the long-term impact on groundwater recharge with a rapid increase in rainwater collection systems? Again, that's very focused issue, but Jamie, I guess you're thinking about the larger issues of water and how Texans are trying to, with such a big issue, also have some kind of personal stake in trying to address the crisis.
That's a question for you. If there was ever a question for Jamie Lozano, it's that question.
I did assume that I would be the one answering this. I really would say, whenever it comes to groundwater and to aquifer recharge, I'm happy to say that this was something that was included in the big Senate bill and funding resolution to, look into aquifer recharge projects and things like that. The reason, whenever it comes to rainwater harvesting, the reason why we see kind of, solutions like that kind of go under the radar in a lot of cases is because, like again, I always go back to Lubbock. In Lubbock, we have the High Plains underground groundwater district, and they are always putting out newsletters that are encouraging people to, go to their seminars and to learn more about rainwater harvesting and to, even pick up supplies that they need from the groundwater district in order to help with their rainwater harvesting. And so I think that this is something that, even though we haven't seen lawmakers really focus on, harvesting rainwater and using that, even though we haven't seen lawmakers focus on that yet, we do see a lot of local groundwater districts who are encouraging it. And I think that there's a bigger curiosity growing for Texans who, who submitted this question, want to do their part.
And last question, a pretty broad one, but I think it also ties into what Representative Darby kind of closed with, what it's not Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, but rather, my word, kind of tension between urban and rural. What are some of the rural issues that all Texans should continue to pay attention to, even beyond the legislative session? Are there issues that may not even be part of the larger kind of public discourse right now, but from your reporting or your conversations kind of will be emerging over the coming years? I know you've touched on some of those, but just as we close, are there a few that you'd want to highlight?
I'll go first. I think, of course, we've talked about water and, the need for better healthcare access out there. I think one of the big topics that we see becoming kind of a bigger disparity for rural and urban communities is whenever it comes to education and more specifically rural brain drain, and how rural communities have a lot of very smart, talented students who don't really have the best colleges or the best job opportunities in their towns, and so they're leaving to bigger cities to get those opportunities. And that's just kind of how that's just really helping kind of tear down rural communities even more. And so that's one that I have in mind.
Carlos?
I would say a pretty latent issue in my region, oil and gas, is abandoned oil and gas wells, or abandoned wells in general. And y'all in San Angelo are kind of smushed in between Central Texas and West Texas, so neighboring an area where this is a big and crowded problem. There's a lot of wells that just have no owner. They get no attention or maintenance. No one really knows what's going on with them. And in our reporting, what we found is that water that the oil and gas industry injects underground that they get from fracking is shooting back up from these wells. And so the Railroad Commission, which is the agency that regulates the oil and gas industry, got a lot more money from this legislative session to deal with this problem. It's in its entire budget, it's almost $600 million, but it's a lot more than they had the last 2 years. So I would say that's an issue we're paying close attention to, whether this money plus some legislation that came out of the State House to address abandoned wells and inactive wells will actually keep this water from surfacing through these abandoned wells.
I'll just close by saying that, this team and the two other reporters who aren't here today, our job is really to help unpack the dynamic between rural Texas and urban Texas and the interplay between the two, and what happens in Lubbock matters in Dallas, what happens in Austin affects Odessa, and so forth and so on. And I will say the one thing that I think I'm most interested in seeing is the technological revolution of the state, thinking about AI, thinking about data centers, and how that impacts rural communities, the water issue, the energy issue. When I think about what is truly going to touch on every facet of life for every Texan over the next 5-10 years, it is going to be this new revolution in data centers and AI. And I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface, and I'm really excited to see what the reporting we do in the future. So, thank you all for sticking around with us online and here in San Angelo. I'll just put in one last plug. If you are interested in what happens outside of Austin and want a weekly newsletter, our team produces the Y'all every Thursday. You can sign up at texastribune.org/newsletters to get a good idea of what's happening around the state. And please consider becoming a member of the Texas Tribune. Thank you all.